Hello and welcome to ThePrint Softcover, an online venue where we launch nonfiction books. Today we have with us Julia Hauser and Sarnath Banerjee, who have partnered to pen this upcoming graphic novel, The Moral Contagion. Let me give you a look of this book. The book is published by HarperCollins and is a detailed study of the three major outbreaks of plague in light of COVID-19 and how pandemics have time and again disrupted and redefined the socio-economic fabric, political power, contemporary human behavior, relationships, and belief systems. Julia Hauser is a senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Kassel, Germany. Her notable works include German religious women in late Ottoman Beirut, competing missions and a taste of purity, an entangled history of vegetarianism. Sarnath Banerjee is a multidisciplinary artist and the co-founder of Phantomville, an award-winning publishing house that brought together writers, reporters, and comic book artists to produce pieces of visual journalism. He has published 5 works of graphic fiction titled The Corridor, The Barn Owl's Wondrous Capers, The Harappa Files, All Quiet in Vikaspuri, and recently The Doab Dil. To start with, the book, I feel it's a beautifully woven, like a historical account of the major outbreaks of the plague and how time and again it has disrupted and rearranged the priorities of a community in every aspect, from political to interpersonal, and mostly in urban civilizations, as we see. So, more often, it is seen that it has brought out the uglier side of the human behavior, leading more towards polarization. And from there, we have come a long way where we battled COVID-19 with much more compassion and empathy for every breathing life in question. So, my first question would be: how do you think that pestilence would lead to the evolution of humanity's moral compass, and does it lead to isolationism, self-centeredness, or do such incidents of shared suffering and grief bring humans together?
So, first of all, of course, it brought out fear in many people. And in such moments, I guess people tend to think of themselves, first of all, and tend to want to avoid contagion. On the other hand, I also came across opposite reactions in some of my sources. For instance, in 17th century London, when I looked at the diary of Samuel Pepys, an upper class person, he very much saw this as a time to break out of convention and to actually engage in socializing. And this is also a reaction that we can find sometimes, and that we also came across in the case of COVID, at least in Germany. I'm aware of this, that some people actually said, no, we do not want to adhere to these new restrictions. We want to incur risks. Life is short, and pandemics make us realize all the more so. And so there have been both reactions, both a tendency to isolate and the opposite tendency to socialize in face of the pandemic. So about the title, I think one thing we can always observe in the history of pandemics is how certain minorities are being scapegoated as alleged spreaders of the disease. And this leads to certain reactions that can broadly be categorized as moral reactions, or morality as a weapon to sort of contain the disease. That is something we can definitely observe with the plague. It happened in medieval Europe, where religious minorities, Jewish minorities, were persecuted. It happened in colonial contexts where lower class people were the ones who were targeted the most. So this comes up time and again. It came up also in the US when the plague broke out in San Francisco, and it was Chinatown that was targeted the most. This is really a pattern, and this accounts for the title of the book. The other thing that really surprised me while I did research for the book is how long actually Greek and Arab medicine were influential in Europe and really across the world. for, in fact, more than 1,000 years, until finally microbes were discovered in the 19th century and vaccines were being developed. Until then, humoral pathology, so the idea that the human body consists of a set of liquids, of humus, and that they must be in balance for humans to stay healthy. This was really the paradigm that that doctors adhered to well into the 19th century. And I knew this for the Middle Ages, I knew this for early modern times, but I wasn't aware that this actually continued into the 19th century and was only slowly replaced by the discovery of microbes. And also certain potions were really widespread across the world. They would today be classified as superstitious, but at the time, doctors really believed that that these were potent medicines. For instance, bezoar, which is in the end an animal substance that hardens and becomes sort of a stone. This was really popular across the world, inter alia, to fight the plague. And also the use of talismans, okay, not in medicine, but it was really widespread in different parts of the world. So many people also resorted to religion and resorted to belief to actually combat this disease or try and combat this disease. And this is also something that we can observe across the world.
As you researched and explored the different epochs of the outbreak, with different religious philosophies and medical responses that came in its way, do you think these pandemics have played a particular role in strengthening the scientific approach of humans to a biological crisis? I mean, from the genesis of vaccine of smallpox, how the religious dogma has played a role in our approach to vaccination?
I mean, first of all, of course, pandemics offered ample opportunities for humans to, expand their scientific knowledge. Of course, crisis situations like this, and this process has been accelerated from the late 19th century onwards with the invention of vaccines. Yes, there have always been religious, precautions. There have always been objections from religious sides to vaccines, even in Europe, at a time that is nowadays thought to have already been quite secular. So there were always also fears concerning vaccines, for instance, because animal substances were involved in the process, and not all humans were comfortable in, getting into closer contact with these substances. Many feared that this would weaken the immune system. This is an argument that you can still hear up to today. There have been many prejudices around vaccine, some of them religiously motivated, some perhaps more distantly so.
Also, this book is also a visual narrative of true historical events. And as I spoke to Sarnath, I would also want your experience, how it has been to work on a historical document. I mean, dealing with a historical document through visuals, because we traveled. This piece definitely transcends time and space, and we're talking about different cultures, different visual cultures to be precise. And what would you think would have been the most challenging aspect of reimagining or bringing it down with visuals from that era and with all the details and everything in place?
Well, I mean, there's one central problem that I've also come across in written sources. Most sources are simply written by middle and upper class people, often men, and other voices are largely absent in these sources. And this also tends to be the case with historical images of the time. Um, there are just certain parts of the population that you can't get at so easily, even though, of course, pandemics always affected the whole of the population and even affected the lower classes worse because they were not in a privileged position in general. They could not isolate themselves so well. They had to work to survive. So I guess these worlds were the most difficult ones to access. Yeah, and then there was also the question how to appeal with this to a present day audience. So there had to be links also to the present, and I think Sarnath did this quite nicely in some of the illustrations that directly allude to, the very recent past with COVID-19. Because this, I think, enables readers to empathize to a greater extent with this very remote past.
You have concluded the piece with a very compelling note, saying that is there really an end to a pandemic, right? But often political events and other priorities have taken the pride of place, right? So, like you wrote, the French colonial government declared that the plague is over in 1915. It was just the onset of the First World War, and even not so much far away, even Russia Ukraine war broke out while the wounds of COVID-19 were still very green. So, do you view this repeating pattern of political stir following major humanitarian crisis? I mean, do you see a pattern, or do you see any cause and effect relationship in this?
Mm. Well, I think it's the basic human need or wish to control such events, which are really beyond human control, you know? And this is especially important also for governments, right? Because they need to signal they're the ones in power. And so declaring a pandemic over might also be a gesture of desperation. I mean, of course, in the case of COVID, also numbers went back, right? With the vaccine and so on, numbers went back in many parts of the world. And so clearly, the situation was no longer as grave as it was months before. But also declaring the pandemic over is really a gesture of, signaling one's power in a situation where one doesn't have so much of that.
Firstly, congratulations on the stunning piece of work that you both have come up with, and a very warm welcome to the print. As a visual artist myself, I found this piece of work very intriguing because it records uh, historical events, and the research is done so meticulously. And so I just want to know about the since you have produced fictional works yourself, and you have been switching between non-fiction and fiction. So um, I would want to know what kind of creative, like, is there a difference in your creative process when you're dealing with a fiction and then you're dealing with historical events, and how does the creative process works for you, like visualizing, interpreting the events and all?
So uh, I will jump straight into working with a historian.
Yeah.
The thing is that while when you're collaborating with a historian, you're creating a world of speculative history yourself. You're looking at the materiality. You're looking at the historical evidences. You're looking at time. You're trying to imagine what it felt like to be in that particular era. You are sort of trying to recreate um because those historical artifacts also have like almost like ghosts. They have ghostly presence. They're sentient, and they speak a lot. So basically, while you're like looking at historical material, you're going through a kind of a parallel history yourself. So this all started when I was trying to look for dwelling pistols when I was doing my second book, Barnhouse Wonderscapers. I was trying to look for how dwelling pistols looked like when Philip Francis and Warren Hastings had a duel in Calcutta, and I remember it being in Victoria and Albert Museum, and did an enormous amount of research trying to kind of dig it out. And thereon, subsequently, I worked at the Princeton University Department of History, working with historians, trying to recreate a certain era and time. Um, and this, working with Julia, had been also a kind of a trying to, when you travel the whole world, trying to create what it could have been like, as sort of, so you're speculating what that world could be. There might be gaps in your knowledge, but trying to kind of recreate that sort of what it felt like. So this is basically a kind of also a parallel historical journey for me as well.
While going through the book, the piece actually transcends time, space, and civilizations because we are talking about 6th century Constantinople, we are talking about um, 14th century Islamic Spain and Europe. So, what was the most challenging bit in showcasing the dichotomy of the visual, like the visual culture of the different civilizations, and how did you find your way through? Because as I read through the book, your illustrations have done a magnificent work in as a binding factor for the narrative. So, what would you say was the
Yeah.
most challenging part in the job?
So it's an interesting question. So not so much challenge, but more like sort of methodology of like how to draw, how to go about drawing. One is to kind of find evidences and like just illustrate them, and and just be done with it. That would be probably like a way historical work would be done easily, like accurate depiction of what a pendant looked like in Florence, or uh, but that you soon lose interest in, because you're just illustrating a certain historical image. Find a costume, you make a person look like, put them in that costume, and you make them walk around or do whatever they do, and well, that was not really working for me for some reason. What I was interested in, like to a completely different trajectory. So, for example, how did Moorish Spain? What was the sound of Alhambra? Like when you suppose you're entering Alhambra, or in Moorish Spain, or even in Cordoba, or in a mosque, or walking on the streets, the pitter patter sounds of footsteps, or the rustle of silk, and this thing, or the fountains, or the birds. What kind of birds would be chirping and stuff like that? And I thought, like, you create a sound atmosphere around, and that kind of opens like a um, large world for yourself, or what it is like to be sort of to imagine when Samuel Pepys was coming back from, because he was commuting between central London and outskirts by the Thames, and in one of those excursions, he found London burning, and it's one of the greatest depiction of burning London. What would he have felt like when he saw that burn London? The again, getting back to the sound, the murmur, the roaring sound of like city burning, and the contrasted by the sound of the gentle the gentle waves of Thames lapping against his boat. And I found, mm, mm, Soham, history, the project of history, I feel, is not so much about like just how to understand the present, because you often get to hear about history repeats itself. We have not learned anything from history, all that stuff. I feel that history is a great humanities project. It makes you empathetic, or empathetic to a group of people who are very removed from you in time and in space, just by getting to those details of how people lived, what they did in that particular era of time, whether it's in China, whether in Japan, whatever time it was. By just reading through it, by just getting to know those details, you sort of feel like you're getting closer to that world. And I think this is why history is a great humanities project. It makes us, become sensitive to other worlds, and it also becomes what it is to imagine, to what it is to be like, to be an other. And this is the way I find working on history. It started with, as I told you, with this Philip Francis's duel, my second book, Barnard's Wonderscaper. Then for Kochi Biennale, I did a whole story on Vasco da Gama based on Sanjay Subramanian's work, and I found these little historical gaps of Vasco da Gama entering Calicut and how he entered. And I have this fictitious character called Digital Datta, who has this annoying ability to sort of find himself. He just appears, prakat, in the middle of history. And he does that. In Barnard's Wonderscaper, he was the wandering Jew. Then he became like the navigator who navigated Vasco da Gama's ship from Malindi in Africa, West Coast Africa, to Calicut. And through Digital Datta, I can kind of enter history from a subaltern point of view, from a point of view of the clerk, from the point of view of the horse, the horsekeeper, or the salesman of objects of novelty. So this is how I like entering history.
I mean, that also explains in the first chapter when you describe the illustrations that you made around the Hagia Sophia with the opening scene. I mean, that explains a lot, the description.
Yeah.
So my next question comes around the cover image. The cover illustration, which I understand it's from the third chapter, where we are talking about the Black Deaths. And what made you think, like, what do you think would be the correct way to say that this illustration becomes the cover picture or the cover illustration for the book? I mean, what?
Well, disappointingly, I didn't select it. I wanted a much less dramatic picture. I wanted to that sort of bring that this sort of pendant which carries these, herbs which are carried by nobility in Florentine Rome. I would have also liked. I would have liked some. I mean, I would have definitely liked the Shanghai images and the Bombay images. This bicycle, these two women in bicycles sending leaflets and things like that. There are many other. The book is full of images, and there were many other images which I liked. Or Yersing's, or the Japanese guy who lost out on the battle of the vaccine, which is a kind of an interesting story of how Europe always sort of wins, And the Japanese guy was sort of never made it, although he was the first one to kind of establish the vaccine. Why did they choose? I left the publisher. I let the publisher and the historian to decide which images they thought. They thought that the image of the Danse Macabre of a young blonde woman being carried away by this sort of this brutal angel of death was a much more evocative image, and it also rings with kind of COVID or whatever, the later sort of stuff like that. They thought it had a much more emotional impact as a cover. I'm personally famously bad at choosing cover images. I look for like the most dullest and the least exciting cover images, but I don't like seducing people to buy books.
So
but I guess there are
looking at
marketing concerns.
Yes, so looking at the illustrations, I would also want to ask you about like the color palette that you chose, like very subdued colors, the pastel shades, and a lot of presence of black that I see. So did you have something going in your mind while you were choosing the color palette or thinking about how to put colors in the illustrations?
Yeah. You see, what happens is there are certain fashionable ways in which color is used. Color, I mean, not fashionable or whatever. There are some trendy ways of using colors. There is a Wes Anderson way of coloring, which is muted colors and all that. Then there is, of course, the more like psychedelic coloring that you see in social media, and which kind of screams out at you and asks for attention. Then you see sort of very Procreate, with the advent of Procreate, a certain kind of color scheme that kind of comes out and like that. Then you have that watercolor and pencil method also that comes out. Now, none of those things attracted me because I thought that the text is very important, and it should not like just sort of I should not subdue the text because Julia is a very good writer, and I think my job is to draw what she has written about. It's not about like I'm the tabla player who wants to like sort of keep the tal, not become like the sort of not the Zakir Hussain.
That's true. So, another thing I wanted to ask is the country that we come from, India, has a very rich history of comic books, be it from
Hmm.
political cartooning to graphic novels. And we have terrific artists who have written on their own, illustrated them, or collaborated with some writer. And there have been a very rich history of illustrated storytelling in India. And when we come to the concluding part of your book, where we're talking about COVID and how it actually disrupted and redefined interpersonal communication with technology coming in, lockdowns, video conferences. At this point, what do you think the culture of visual storytelling or illustrated storytelling stands in India right now? And what do you think about the community that is in play right now?
I can tell you about the current comic book culture that is happening. It's very vibrant. There's a lot of indie comic book people, which I'm very excited about. Uh, uh, there's Anand, for example, he calls himself Pagal Kutta in Instagram, and there's Anupam Arunachalam. There's between Swamine. They do like this sort of fantastic indie comics. This indie comics festival happens in most cities, and they bring in a lot of things. And you also realize that younger people or young people or whatever, or not so young people also, they are coming out of this sort of whole social media trap, which is
Hmm.
like you've got a huge number of people who are following you, but it's like sometimes it feels like ghost friends. You're like sort of some weird disembodied kind of fan club who does not, whether they exist or doesn't exist doesn't really matter, but every time you put together something, the whole country follows you. Sort of it all feels like sort of very sort of vague. But when people actually come out and put together this conference, these what do you call that, these fests where indie comics people come, they share ideas, they talk, they buy each other's work, they can hold each other's work. I think there's a pushback against this sort of, oh, I hope so, against this sort of hyper social media based, electronic based sort of work. I mean, that also exists, but the fact that which it slows down the art process. So there's more slow art, which is very important. That means you don't just get a inspiration, you quickly write it and put it out. Just sort of take time, and you kind of put things together over a period of time. And I think that's healthy for any medium. It's also like creating this, like I told you, community building. So there's a lot of people that connected with each other. They go to other towns, they meet up each other. They go to like outside the country. They know each other's work. They buy each other's work. Other people buy each other's, which I think is fantastic. That's something I certainly really regret not having when I was young. Um, um, so and then for example, like comics has been like sort of now over a long period of time become like part of curricula and part of, so I'm like who I mean it's still I find it very baffling that I teach at IIT Gandhinagar um, in the humanities and philosophy department, and they are hosting a comic book colloquium or a narrative storytelling colloquium where they're bringing people from like cognitive sciences. One of the professors here, Orgo Manna, who does history of science, it's his initiative. He started the whole this, and he's bringing all these sort of brain scientists, cognitive scientists, comic book artists working together. Um, and this is all happening IIT, paid by IIT, kind of thing. So that shows that how powerful this medium is happening, because there are echoes of it outside our field. Like we have biologists sort of working and trying to kind of seek out comic book artists to kind of work with. So it's a very robust. It's on in a very robust health right now. And I was just recently in Nagaland in a conference, and you see that it's also a fantastic way to understand the locality, your local ideas, local problems, local influences, not internet influences, but the guy who makes fantastic whatever momos or whatever in the Dimapur Central Market, or the ghosts of a certain abandoned building, or political memories of a silenced, by mainstream. Mainstream media has silenced a certain kind of political memory or movements in Kashmir or somewhere. Comics is becoming a powerful medium for all these people, and I'm very proud of the new lot of comic writers who are coming out.
Thanks for the conversation.